Venezuela was once the envy of Latin America, a nation so wealthy from its oil reserves that it seemed destined for endless prosperity, a place where citizens enjoyed subsidized healthcare, free education, and a standard of living that rivaled many developed countries. At its peak in the 1970s and early 1980s, Venezuela boasted the highest per capita income in the region, and Caracas, its capital, glittered with modern skyscrapers, luxury cars, and a thriving middle class that vacationed in Miami and sent their children to study abroad. The country sits atop the world's largest proven oil reserves, larger even than Saudi Arabia's estimated at around 300 billion barrels, a geological jackpot that should have guaranteed generations of wealth and stability. Yet today, Venezuela is synonymous with economic collapse, hyperinflation, mass immigration, and political turmoil. A cautionary tale of how even the most resource-rich nations can spiral into crisis when mismanagement, corruption, and over-reliance on a single commodity converge. So how did a country with such immense natural wealth end up in ruins? To understand Venezuela's tragic trajectory, we need to go back to the beginning of its oil boom and trace the decisions, both political and economic, that led to one of the most dramatic collapses in modern history. Venezuela's oil industry took off in the early 20th century when foreign companies, primarily American and European firms, began drilling in the Maracaibo Basin, transforming the country from a largely agrarian economy into a petrostate almost overnight. By the 1920s, Venezuela had become one of the world's leading oil exporters, and the government began to reap substantial revenues from royalties and taxes on foreign oil companies. This influx of oil money fundamentally reshaped Venezuelan society. Rural workers flocked to cities. The government expanded rapidly, and a new urban middle class emerged. However, even in these early boom years, warning signs appeared. The economy became increasingly dependent on oil exports. Agriculture declined as the country imported more food, and income inequality persisted despite the overall wealth. In 1976, President Carlos Andrés Pérez nationalized the oil industry, creating Petróleos de Venezuela, or PDVSA, which became one of the largest and most profitable state-owned oil companies in the world. Nationalization was popular and seen as a way to ensure that oil wealth benefited Venezuelans directly rather than foreign shareholders. For a time, this strategy seemed to work. PDVSA was well-managed, technically sophisticated, and generated enormous revenues that funded social programs, infrastructure projects, and government operations. But the seeds of future trouble were already being planted. The government grew accustomed to spending oil revenues as if the high prices would last forever. And when global oil prices crashed in the 1980s, Venezuela faced its first serious economic crisis. The 1980s and 1990s were turbulent decades for Venezuela, marked by mounting debt, inflation, and social unrest as governments struggled to adjust to lower oil revenues. In 1989, President Pérez implemented a package of market-oriented economic reforms recommended by the International Monetary Fund, including fuel subsidy cuts, which led to massive protests and riots known as the Caracazo, a traumatic event that left hundreds dead and shattered public confidence in the political establishment. It was during this period of disillusionment that a young military officer named Hugo Chávez attempted a coup in 1992, which failed but made him a folk hero to many Venezuelans who felt betrayed by the traditional elites. 6 years later, Chávez won the presidency in a landslide, promising to redistribute oil wealth to the poor and challenge what he called the corrupt oligarchy that had long dominated Venezuelan politics. Chávez's rise coincided with a dramatic rebound in global oil prices, and for much of his presidency, from 1999 until his death in 2013, Venezuela enjoyed another oil boom that allowed him to fund ambitious social programs known as missions, providing free healthcare, subsidized food, housing assistance, and literacy campaigns that genuinely improved the lives of millions of poor Venezuelans. His supporters saw him as a champion of the dispossessed, and his charisma and anti-imperialist rhetoric resonated across Latin America. However, Chávez's economic policies were deeply flawed in ways that would prove catastrophic once oil prices fell. He expanded government control over the economy, nationalizing hundreds of private companies and sectors ranging from telecommunications to agriculture, often compensating owners with bonds rather than cash, and installing political loyalists rather than experienced managers. PDVSA, once a model of technical competence, was purged of thousands of professionals after a 2002 to 2003 oil strike, replaced with workers chosen for political loyalty rather than expertise, which led to declining production and deteriorating infrastructure. Price controls on basic goods were implemented to make food and essentials affordable, but these controls discouraged private production and led to shortages as businesses could not operate profitably. The government printed money to finance spending rather than implementing sustainable fiscal reforms, and corruption flourished as oil revenues flowed through opaque state institutions with little oversight. Chávez also used oil wealth for geopolitical goals, selling subsidized oil to allies across Latin America and the Caribbean through programs like PetroCaribe, which won him friends abroad but drained resources at home. When Hugo Chávez died in 2013, global oil prices were still relatively high, and his hand-picked successor, Nicolás Maduro, inherited a country that appeared stable on the surface, but was economically fragile beneath. Maduro lacked Chávez's charisma and political skill, and within a year of his taking office, global oil prices began a steep decline from over $100 per barrel in 2014 to below $30 by early 2016. Venezuela's economy, which had become even more dependent on oil under Chávez, accounting for roughly 95% of export revenues, went into free fall. The government's response was disastrous. Rather than implementing painful but necessary reforms such as cutting subsidies, devaluing the currency, or reducing public spending, Maduro doubled down on the same failed policies, printing ever more money to cover budget deficits and imposing even stricter price controls. The result was hyperinflation on a scale rarely seen. Outside of wartime, the International Monetary Fund estimated that inflation reached over 1,000,000% in 2018, effectively wiping out the savings of ordinary Venezuelans and making the currency worthless. Supermarket shelves emptied as producers stopped making goods they could not sell profitably, and people began bartering or using foreign currency for basic transactions. The healthcare system collapsed as hospitals ran out of medicine and equipment, and preventable diseases that had been eradicated decades earlier, like measles and diphtheria, returned. Malnutrition became widespread, with reports of Venezuelans losing significant weight due to lack of food, a phenomenon grimly dubbed the Maduro diet. Crime soared as desperate people turned to theft and violence, and the murder rate became one of the highest in the world. Meanwhile, oil production plummeted from over 3 million barrels per day in the late 1990s to less than 1 million barrels by 2020, as years of underinvestment, mismanagement, and U.S. sanctions took their toll on aging infrastructure and the skilled workforce that had largely fled the country. Over 7 million Venezuelans, roughly a quarter of the population, have immigrated since the crisis began, primarily to neighboring Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, and Chile, but also to the United States and Europe. In one of the largest displacement crises in the Western Hemisphere's recent history, the political situation also deteriorated sharply, with Maduro's government becoming increasingly authoritarian to maintain power in the face of widespread public anger. Opposition leaders were jailed. Protests were violently suppressed. Elections were widely seen as fraudulent, and the legislature was sidelined in favor of a loyalist constituent assembly. International sanctions imposed by the United States and European Union, intended to pressure Maduro to restore democracy, further isolated Venezuela's economy and complicated efforts to sell oil, though debate continues about whether sanctions worsened the humanitarian crisis or simply targeted an already collapsing regime. So, what went wrong, and what lessons does Venezuela's story offer? At its core, Venezuela's collapse was the result of the resource curse, a well-documented phenomenon where countries rich in natural resources often experience slower economic growth, more corruption, and greater instability than resource-poor nations. When a government can fund itself entirely through oil revenues, it has little incentive to build a diversified economy, invest in education and innovation, or maintain the institutions and rule of law that sustain long-term prosperity. Venezuela never developed strong checks and balances, independent courts, or a professional civil service insulated from political interference, making it vulnerable to the whims of populist leaders who prioritized short-term political gains over sound economic management. The failure to save during boom times, to establish a sovereign wealth fund like Norway's, or invest in infrastructure and human capital, meant that when prices fell, there was no cushion to soften the blow. Corruption siphoned off billions of dollars that could have been used productively, and the concentration of power in the executive branch allowed disastrous policies to continue unchecked long after their failures became obvious. Some economists also point to the role of external factors. U.S. sanctions, while targeted at the regime, undoubtedly made it harder for Venezuela to access international markets and financing, and the global shift toward renewable energy raises questions about the long-term viability of oil-dependent economies. Yet neighboring countries with similar challenges, like Colombia and Peru, managed to avoid Venezuela's fate, suggesting that policy choices matter more than external circumstances. Today, Venezuela remains in a state of limbo. Maduro clings to power with support from the military, Cuba, Russia, and China, while the opposition, though weakened and divided, continues to call for democratic change. Recent reports suggest some modest economic stabilization as the government has quietly relaxed price controls and allowed more use of foreign currency. But the underlying problems, destroyed institutions, collapsed infrastructure, and a deeply polarized society will take decades to rebuild. Venezuela's story is a powerful reminder that natural resources alone do not guarantee prosperity, and that without sound institutions, fiscal discipline, and economic diversification, even the wealthiest nations can lose everything. And that's something worth remembering when you next hear about countries relying too heavily on a single resource for their future.